Your brain needs support, and new Ollie Brainy Chews are a delightful way to take care of your cognitive health. Made with scientifically backed ingredients like Thai ginger, L-theanine, and caffeine, Brainy Chews support healthy brain function and help you find your focus, stay chill, or get energized. Be kind to your mind and get these nootropic chews at ollie.com. That's OLLY.com. These statements have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration. This product is not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease.
I have a mission which is to bring journalistic skills and practices to a world that I had lived in and that I really do love, but that also I wanted to hold it to account. I didn't want to idealize it.
Welcome back to Working. I'm your host, Isaac Butler.
And I am your other host, Ronald Young Jr.
Ronald, normally this is the time in the show where one of us says, "Oh, whose voice was that we just heard?" But duh, that's the voice of our wonderful co-host, June Thomas. Because today, in the words of the great Strong Bad, the tables have turned, and you are interviewing her. What is up with that?
Yes, the tables have indeed turned. And I'm so excited because June has written her first book.
Yeah, June! Woo!
Yeah,
That's our live studio audience.
The book is called A Place of Our Own, 6 Spaces That Shaped Queer Women's Culture. And it's kind of a history of the spaces in which queer women have found safety and community. And let me tell you, I'm almost through the chapter on bars, and I've learned so much. It's such a warm and informative journey.
Well, I would expect nothing less than warm and informative from June Thomas. Do our Slate Plus folks get anything extra in their stocking this week?
Oh, you know they do, Isaac. I don't know if you've been hearing that question that women have been answering recently about whether they'd rather be trapped in the woods with a man or a bear.
Now, here, because of the subject matter of the book and everything like that, by bear, we mean the animal bear.
Yes.
Not a large, hirsute gay man.
Good that we have that explainer there. But yes, an actual bear. So we talk a little bit about that question, and we talk about the nuanced decision to tell cis straight men to maybe avoid a bar intended specifically for queer women to gather. I also give June some room to construct her perfect queer space, and she has a bit of fun doing that.
That's amazing. I can't wait to listen to that. And if you, like me, are a Slate Plus member, that segment will be waiting for you at the end of this week's program. If you're not, like me, a Slate Plus member, I mean, what are you waiting for? You get charming segments like that one, bonus segments on other shows like the Culture Gabfest, bonus full episodes of shows like Slow Burn and Decoder Ring, full access behind the paywall, and the warm, virtuous feeling of knowing that you're supporting what we do right here on Working. Go to slate.com/working plus to sign up today. Thanks in advance. Now, let's listen in on Ronald's conversation with the great June Thomas.
What's the best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day in everyday situations. But if that's not on the cards this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. I've used apps in the past to learn new languages, but when I came across Babbel, I wondered if it could help me refresh my knowledge of a language I once spoke well, but was now a little bit or quite a lot rusty. I have to say, I was impressed. The advanced lessons were really useful, tips and idioms that can help with in-depth conversations on topics that I can actually imagine chatting about. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel is designed by real people for real conversations, and the tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. What's more, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited time deal for working listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for working listeners at babbel.com/working. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/working, spelled BABBEL.com/working. Rules and restrictions may apply.
June Thomas, hello.
Hello, Ronald.
It feels unusual because normally I start these types of conversations with who are you and what do you do? But that feels a little redundant this episode. So why don't you remind the listeners who you are outside of the Working podcast?
Well, the reason we're speaking today, Ronald, is that my first book, A Place of Our Own, 6 Spaces That Shaped Queer Women's Culture, is being published on May 28th.
Yeah.
And so I am officially an author.
Nice.
And I think right now that other than working and an occasional podcast guest appearance, that's what I do. I write books. And that is, it's very hard for me to say that because even though I've been doing that for a couple of years now, it doesn't feel like a real job somehow.
Speaking of that, like change in definition, what is it like to transition to the something? Because we're normally talking about things like imposter syndrome. We're saying like,
right,
I don't think I'm supposed to be this thing. But when you're actually doing the work of doing the thing, whatever that thing is,
yes.
In this case, your case, becoming an author, what is that transition like?
So because I had been a journalist for at least 25 years, it was recognizable. I knew what these tasks were. It's just that instead of writing 500 words or 1,000 words, or sometimes as we would at Slate, 5,000 words, I was writing, let's just say, 75,000 words. Mm-hmm. And also because my book is about 6 distinct places, I knew going in what the chapters were going to be about.
Yeah.
I didn't know the details because I would go into the research and, okay, find out everything you can about, for example, softball.
Yeah.
But, it was also approachable. It didn't seem that different from what I had been doing before. But also, for the last, 5 years of my time at Slate, I hadn't been writing. I had been doing some podcasting, but also being kind of a middle manager. I think my title was the senior managing producer of Slate Podcasts. But I wasn't writing. So that was actually the hardest part, was remembering how to do that. So it felt both familiar and, because it was so much larger, very strange.
It sounds like, you're comfortable writing. Has writing always been your main creative outlet?
Yes. It was what I always wanted to do, and I was one of those kids who always I thought I was the greatest writer. And that's, if somebody had to document what was going on, I would always volunteer for that role. Mm-hmm. I always saw myself as a writer. But when it comes to wanting to just kind of do something creative, because it also has become my job, then it's not something that necessarily feels like fun all the time. Mm-hmm. So I have to kind of do very specific kinds of writing in order for it to be like a creative outlet. So I'll make little journals of what I'm watching on TV or what books I'm reading, and I'll draw the book or I'll draw a scene from the TV show. And that is very much something that I'm doing intentionally in order to kind of take a break from my work writing. Yeah. I still enjoy writing, and it's something that I find fun, but it has to seem different enough from what I'm getting paid for, or else I'm just working in my off hours.
What inspired you to write A Place of Our Own?
There were, as always, several factors. Mm-hmm. When I worked at Slate, I was always a couple of decades older than most of the other people there. And so I was usually talking and friends with people who were a good deal younger than me. And even people who were part of my communities often had what to me seemed like erroneous ideas, or just didn't know anything about things that had been a big part of my life. And they are incredibly smart people who read a lot, who, inform themselves about stuff. And I just thought, well, if these people that I work with, who I have so much respect for, don't know about this stuff, maybe it's a good subject. Mm-hmm. And also, when you are a person who wants to write a book, one of the things they tell you to do is kind of look at your shelves, at your bookshelves, and like what are the big topics that are represented on those shelves. And one of mine is bullfighting. I wasn't going to become a bullfighter or write about bullfighting.
Oh, I want that book, June. That's the book I want.
Yeah, that'd be a very short book, I think. And there were a few other kind of concentrations, but really, basically, I had a lot of books about lesbians. And one of the things I love to do is talk to especially older lesbians. And also one other thing that was kind of in the air was a lot of talk about the disappearance of either lesbian culture or specifically usually lesbian bars. You know, there's this statistic that we hear a lot, there were more than 200 in 1987. Now, at the time of recording, I believe there are officially 32. And, in some ways that's just bonkers. There are 32 lesbian bars in a country of 332 million people. But I also really wanted to counter this idea that lesbian culture is disappearing. Of course it isn't. Yes, there are far fewer bars, lesbian bars defined narrowly as lesbian bars or who identify themselves as lesbian bars. But there are so many more places people can go. There's so many more places where queer people can be themselves. It's just that things are changing. It's not that our culture is disappearing, it's that it's evolving. And so I just wanted to explore the history. I wanted to explore the evolution.
So, June, you're largely speaking of queer women. There's a passage in your book where you say, when I speak of queer women, I'm using the phrase as an umbrella term for non-straight people who are not cisgender men. I suspect this imprecision will irritate some readers, but is the reality of lesbian feminist organizing and community building where we have always understood that identity is a fugitive thing. I like this because you started in the next paragraph, you end up with a bunch of very big questions. Can you talk to me a little bit about that choice to talk specifically about queer women and to use the label queer women?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because even as you ask that question, I say, well, it isn't only for queer women because it's also for trans men. It's also for non-binary people. It's also for, it's basically everybody who isn't a cisgender man and also actually a gay man. And partly it's that we really don't have yet. And please let us find one soon. Let us, I think we need to have like a plenary meeting of all the people I'm calling queer women to figure out a term that we can use instead of like having to have these long discussions, because we need something that means everybody except cis het guys, or in some cases, everybody except cis guys. But I'm very, so there is that naming, nomenclature discussion. But it is also important to me too, for everyone to be aware that these identities do change. They are fugitive. None of the places I talk about were ever exclusively lesbian, even if they thought they were. And, Lesbian Lamb, for example, which intentionally set out to find a place that is exclusively for lesbians. They might have been lesbians on day 1. They might have all been lesbians on day 50. They might not all have been lesbians on day 75, even if it was the exact same bunch of women. Like, that's just not how sexuality works. And we also now are much more aware that it's not how gender works. We might not have been aware of that in 1975, but we sure are now. So as awkward as it is, and I suppose as much as there will be pushback about it, I just think that it's impossible to narrow down, this was for this group, this was for this group. It's for all of us, except for cis guys.
You mentioned early in the book that queer women seeking places to gather and connect, they often found themselves in less than savory spaces run by folks of ill repute like the mafia, which as soon as I read that, it clicked for me. It was like, well, yeah, of course. Can you talk a little bit about that overlap between like the idea of like finding yourself connected with the mob just because you want to get out and meet other lesbians?
Yeah, I mean, it is it's a story that I feel like I know exactly what the women of the 40s, 50s, 60s. I know what drove them, even though I can't truly experience the fear and the danger that they must have experienced. But I do understand exactly why they wanted to find other people like them, because otherwise they were doomed to loneliness, and nobody wants that. And not only loneliness, but there was serious danger. If people found out that they were queer, they could lose their jobs, and not just could, but usually did lose their jobs, lose their apartments. If they had kids, lose their kids. There was no security, and yet they were drawn to places where they could meet other people like themselves in some way. And the places that were available at a certain point, the only one that people at least were aware of, for the most part, was the bar. And these bars, because, again, there's this strange thing where it's not exactly clear to what extent, even in somewhere like New York City, where you think, okay, it should be pretty easy to figure out, was it illegal for queer people to gather in bars, for bars to serve queer people in the year X? But it's really very hard to figure that out, because the forces who wanted to control queer people and other marginalized people, their entire strategy was to keep things vague.
Yeah.
These were vague laws or vague rules, very inconsistently applied, because that suited the people who wanted to control where people socialized and what people were allowed to do. And so in those circumstances, a sort of, whatever you want to call it, a legitimate business person, they're not going to get involved in that. If you don't even know who you can serve, if you don't know if the cops are going to bust you, why would you go into business? There are lots of other businesses you could go into. If you want to run a bar, run another kind of bar.
Yeah.
But also, there were people who were going to go to these bars, and you could do whatever you wanted almost in those bars. So they drew a kind of twilight world of entities like the mafia. At the same time, people were so drawn to them because they had this need to find other people, to find friends, to find lovers, to find communities, to find, there's all kinds of reasons why they were drawn, but I understand exactly why they wanted not to be alone.
I mentioned this to you, but I'm only 50 pages in. I'm almost done with the lesbian bar chapter. But like you said, you cover a different space each time. You're covering lesbian bars, feminist bookstores, the softball diamond, lesbian land, feminist sex toy stores, and vacation destinations.
Yes.
I imagine that you have some connection to each one of these spaces, but is there one or a few that you hold closer to your heart than others?
Yes. So it's funny. I knew I had to write about lesbian bars because they are the place where most people go to. When they realize they're queer, they go to a queer bar. And I've had amazing fun. I love to dance. I have had so much fun in bars, but they're frustrating. Sometimes you have a miserable time and, whatever. And so it has always frustrated me that they are considered the place. Mm-hmm. So my favorite place was, and is, I shouldn't talk about it in the past tense because they still exist. And they're actually flourishing in a different way than they did in the boom times, were feminist bookstores.
That feels very on brand for you, an author.
I know,
writer, yeah.
I know, right?
Yeah.
I know, and a bookish person. But again, this is this weird thing of certain people like bookstores, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's to be understood. But there is, for certain kinds of queer people, someone said to me, it's so weird that we have to go into a bookstore to figure out who we are. Mm. But several people told me that was true for them, that they walked around, the bookstore wanting to kind of take a look at those books in the lesbian section or the queer section and just just take another tour around and maybe I'll stop and have a look. And, people actually said to me that, they flicked through a book of interviews with queer people and just recognized themselves. And so, after 20 minutes of flipping, they knew who they were. And I hear myself, when you say that, how can that be? How can people find themselves and know who they are? Like, register their own identity. But it is a matter of like, I know that I'm different somehow. I don't know, which community I belong to. You read something, you're like, oh yeah, it's this one. There are other people like me. And those bookstores, even though they weren't exclusively queer space, I mean, there were gay bookstores, but those tended to be owned by men, slightly different, although they certainly were more welcoming of women than gay bars, for example. Mm-hmm. But it was a whole ecosystem that these bookstores, they also were the place you could meet people. Bookstores are a much more approachable place than a bar. You can go any time of the day. You can, you don't have to be, there's no age restrictions. You don't have to spend money if you don't want to. You can just go and, and I worked in one, and I can tell you, a lot of people would go in just to have a conversation, either with other shoppers or other people working there. Again, because they had questions, and people would always be calling, wanting to find out, where can I go? And it could have been, where can I go to meet people? But it also was like, I need a doctor who won't, I had a bad experience. Can you tell me a doctor who's not going to insult me? Or where can I find a place to live? There were these incredible resources as well as businesses.
Yeah, it strikes me, and I'm sure you have to see either the irony or the synchronicity or the symmetry of you talking about loving talking to older lesbians, but also one of your favorite spaces being a place that is literally there to pass knowledge along, while also writing a book that is intended to pass knowledge along. Yeah. Can you talk to me a little bit about that transition for yourself as to being one who was receiving the knowledge to now one that is giving the knowledge? How has that been for you? And is this a place that you want to be? What does that even look like for you?
Yeah. And I have to say that I was aware that I was sort of playing a lot of different roles in this. As you said, many of these spaces, there's an autobiographical element. I talk about my experience in these spaces, what they meant to me, what I did in them, basically what they meant to me. And then I did research, it was basically historical, but also I brought my sort of journalistic skills. So just to kind of give some context, I am one of those people who really had several lives. When I was until I was maybe 35, maybe a little bit older even, I worked in feminist projects. I worked in basically, they were never exclusively lesbian feminists, but feminist projects, and it was a separate world. I worked in bookstores and on newspapers and a radio show on WPFW in DC. Mm-hmm. And, then I worked at a feminist press. I was almost living a separate existence. And I was very much in that world. And then I kind of stepped out and, worked in a mainstream publication or the mainstream press. And developed. I already had developed journalistic skills working in feminist publications, but it is different in somewhere like Slate than somewhere like Offerbacks. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to bring those journalistic skills and practices to a world that I had lived in and that I really do love, but that also I wanted to hold it to account. I didn't want to idealize it. Mm-hmm. I wanted people both inside the world to recognize what I was talking about and to recognize the flaws, the mistakes that had been made, the challenges, and also to celebrate them and to just make sure more people know how amazing these places were and what amazing achievements people made with nothing,
Yeah.
We'll be back with more of Ronald's conversation with June Thomas after this.
Reboot your credit card with Apple Card, the only credit card designed for iPhone. It gives you up to 3% daily cash back on every purchase. Plus, Apple Card has no fees, not even hidden ones. Apply for Apple Card now in the Wallet app on iPhone. Apple Card issued by Goldman Sachs Bank USA, Salt Lake City branch. Subject to credit approval. Variable APRs for Apple Card range from 19.24% to 29.49% based on creditworthiness. Rates as of February 1st, 2024. Terms and more at applecard.com. What's the best way to learn a language? Immersion, living where the language is spoken and using it every day in everyday situations. But if that's not on the cards this year, you can still learn a language the second best way, and that's with Babbel. I've used apps in the past to learn new languages, but when I came across Babbel, I wondered if it could help me refresh my knowledge of a language I once spoke well, but was now a little bit or quite a lot rusty. I have to say, I was impressed. The advanced lessons were really useful, tips and idioms that can help with in-depth conversations on topics that I can actually imagine chatting about. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons are handcrafted by over 200 language experts to help you start speaking a new language in as little as 3 weeks. Babbel is designed by real people for real conversations, and the tips and tools are approachable, accessible, rooted in real-life situations, and delivered with conversation-based teaching so you're ready to practice what you've learned in the real world. What's more, all of Babbel's 14 award-winning language courses are backed by their 20-day money-back guarantee. Here's a special limited-time deal for working listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for working listeners, at babbel.com/working. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/working, spelled BABBEL.com/working. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Listeners, we want to hear from you. Every other Thursday, I don't know if you've noticed this, but we do this show called Working Overtime. It's very advice-focused. It's really about creative dilemmas. So please tell us your creative challenges and let us help you. Drop us a line at working@slate.com. You can also send a voice memo to that address or give us a ring and leave us a voicemail at 304-933-WORK. Now, let's get back to Ronald's conversation with the great June Thomas.
You talk a bit about Elaine Romagnoli, who was she opened many lesbian bars, and she was an entrepreneur over and over again. And what the passage you write is, she considered lesbian bars an almost sacred community resource because they're so often where people go to discover themselves. You can always tell where someone was coming to a gay bar for the first time because of how frightened and uncomfortable they were as they approached the doorway, she told me. I made a concerted effort to focus on them and introduce them to my bartender, and my bartender would always introduce them to people. To Romagnoli, owning a lesbian bar was inherently a political act, and her activism relied on her ability to keep the lights on. So there was that. I read that, and I'm like, the idea of owning, especially a commercial space, as an act of activism, if you will. Do you consider writing this book to be an act of activism? Because when I read it and looking at the title, I'm like, it doesn't feel activism in the way like, we're not gonna take it, like not in that way, but it does feel like it feels important in terms of having the knowledge, and it just does feel like activism in that way. And I'm just wondering if you saw it that way as well.
Absolutely. But I didn't become aware of that until pretty deep into the project because, again, I think having 6 different spaces and telling 6 different stories, but realizing that these patterns kept emerging. So many of the challenges were created because they were mission-driven businesses and they were mission-driven people. And then I realized, I have a mission too. I have a mission which is to, tell the world how great these places were, to get the word out, to make this history more easily accessible, also to not sugarcoat it, not to idealize it. But it was very much a mission. And that also made it harder because I never didn't want to, ask a tough question. But I just say sometimes it was hard for me to ask questions of people I really admired in a way that it wouldn't be a problem if I was just, doing a story about, some other topic that I didn't have this level of commitment and care about, where I would, hopefully there's something you admire in everybody you talk with, but, there's almost like a reverence for some of the people and the roles and the work that they did. And yeah, that makes it harder to be a sort of a cold-hearted reporter.
Well, I guess for me, when I'm thinking about the writing that you're doing, it's so approachable. And even the parts where you're talking about like it doesn't strike me as the parts where you're talking about like a black patronage of a bar.
Yeah.
And you're saying like what that looked like in terms of the racial divide in those days. It doesn't strike me as you moralizing it, because I think our tendency is to moralize these things and say this was right or wrong. You speak about it as a fact of the time. And me as the reader, I'm readily able to identify that this was not the right thing to do. Even in a marginalized space, I'm readily able to identify that. So I would say that like the writing you do, it does not come across as written by someone as a cold-hearted reporter. But I imagine that as you're doing this research, it is difficult to find out these things about a history that you admire, that you're deeply connected to, when you find out that there were missteps and there were sometimes places where people were being problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. And, also that sometimes people complained and they just didn't know the whole story. One of the things, just to talk more about bars, if there's one thing that you can be sure, if you put two lesbians together, they will complain about the local lesbian bar. I mean, that is guaranteed. I mean, we will complain more about our places because we care about them more. I mean, I think that's true of every community. We hold them in reverence, but we also have high expectations. And, there's a beautiful story, which I'm actually not sure if it's in the bar chapter or the postscript. But when I found this piece, it was something that I found in a really obscure publication that came out of Portland, Oregon, very few issues. And I was so proud of myself, not only for finding it, but also about 10, 12, 15 pages of this newsletter were all about the local bar, because a new lesbian bar had opened and the local lesbians were really mad at it. And they put a sign on the door that said, "This bar exploits women." And they said the drinks are too expensive. You won't play our music. You let men in. And they had all these complaints. And so the people who ran the women who were making the newsletter went to the owners of the bar and said, would you mind just responding to this? And they were incredibly open. They even shared like their profit and loss statement was just published in this, in this local newsletter. And the thing is, they had to charge more because it was a new bar and they still were paying off all the equipment. They had a lot of loans. They weren't going to play, the sort of soft, slow women's music in the bar, just like the other bars didn't. They didn't complain that they were playing rock and roll in the other bar. Yeah. But, they wanted it in there. And then you can't not let men into a bar. I mean, men is the bar that wish you could, but you can't. Of course, in the other bar there were men because it wasn't an exclusively lesbian bar. But sometimes we have irrational demands, and so to kind of just say, what, I know you want this, but you can't have it, and you have to understand the other side. It's almost hard to give that pushback, but also it's necessary because, it's so much easier to complain. When you're complaining, you don't actually want to know what the problems are. You just want to enjoy a good complaint.
Yeah, agreed.
But, part of the job of, telling as wide a story as you can, as kind of broad a story as you can, is to answer all, to say, actually, when you complain about that, here's why it just can't be.
Tell me a little bit about your research process. What did it look like to actually go after because it's well researched, like there, and you do a good job of connecting it as a narrative. So tell me a little bit about that process. What does it look like for you to actually go get this information?
So I would say this book took 2 years to write. The first year when I was in New York, I had thought that I would be going out to places. I'd be traveling. I'd be talking in person with people. I'd be going to archives. And that just wasn't possible because it was COVID. It was, some of it happened in lockdown, but even in that post-lockdown period, smaller archives, volunteer-run archives, even something like the Lesbian History Archives, which was just a few blocks from where I lived, they just weren't open. They weren't letting people have physical access. So I ended up doing a lot of my research staring at a computer screen, but that still allowed me to just, flip through newsletters from the 70s. In the softball chapter, one of the stories that I tell, most of the chapters each has a sort of one story that can't tell the whole history of that place, but kind of represents some of the struggles. And in the softball chapter, it was of the Alpha Omegas. That was the softball team that was started by the Atlanta Lesbian Feminist Alliance in, I believe, 1974. And to find out the story of that team, before I talked to any of the people who'd been involved, I wanted to read, what did they say at the time? Because it was 50 years ago. So I was, kind of painstakingly reading every, newsletter issue from it was at the beginning, it was called the Alpha Newsletter. And then once I felt that I thought I knew the story, I could talk to people who had been there at the time and lived it and say, like, okay, it seems to me, is that right? And then when I did those interviews, again, where I thought I would be traveling around and going to places to talk to people, it ended up mostly being on Zoom, which, I'm not complaining about because it was certainly a lot cheaper to do it that way. And, because on Zoom, you can look at people and you can, it's not exactly the same as being in person. And you certainly can't, see the things that it's different, but you do have eye contact. You can sort of read their body language and see what it is that, they're feeling emotional about or that they are kind of checked out on. So I certainly it wasn't what I expected, but I was glad that Zoom was available.
June Thomas, I really enjoyed the book so far. I'm certainly going to finish it. I'm coming to your book event, and I really want everyone to read this. So I thank you so much for joining us here on Worky, even though you work here.
Thank you, Ronald. It was strange to be on this side of things, but I'm so glad to have the experience of the Ronald Young Jr. interview.
When we come back, Ronald and I will talk about what we talk about when we talk about culture and the craft and glories of investigating your own background.
Pulling up to Mickey D's just for drinks? Oh yeah, that's me. Nothing extra, just perfection and a straw. Coming in hot for the coldest cups on the block. Because there are drinks. Then there are drinks from McDonald's.
Ever combine an ice-cold frozen Coke with piping hot fries? Try frozen drinks any size for $1.49. Prices and participation may vary. Cannot be combined with any other offer.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Ronald, I always love talking to June. I've been doing it for like a decade now in real life and in various podcasts, and I always love listening to her. So it was so wonderful to hear her talk about her transition into being a full-time writer of books and about how she approached this particular one. I really want to talk about culture here. Part of this is because, like, I'm a historian and critic of culture. Part of this is because my daughter is doing this thing in school called Culture Shares now, where each student has to do like a 15-minute presentation on some aspect of their culture. But also, I was struck by that line that Cameron put at the top of the episode about June wanting to both tell the story of this world that she came out of, but also, quote, hold it to account, end quote. I think there's often a lot of pressure within communities to not air our dirty laundry in front of outsiders, particularly if you come from a minority with a history of persecution, as June, you, and I all do. If you want to tell the truth in all of its complexity about your community to the general public, what are your thoughts about navigating that?
It's tough because the reason why minorities don't like doing that is because it sometimes can be weaponized against them. Like it's almost like the reason why I don't say the N-word in front of white people is because I don't want them feeling comfortable to say the N-word around me, even though it's something I use within my community of friends and companions in much more casual settings. But that being said, like when it comes to our history, there are parts of all of our minority history that are like ugly and a little bit like dirty and complicated. And I think telling the whole story only lends itself to making us more complex as people. And I think the fear is having that information be weaponized as a tool for further oppression in most of these communities. That's why we tend to hold those secrets to ourselves.
Yeah, totally. I think of this phrase that Jews have, a shanda for the goyim, which means, so Jews, one of the amazing things about us is that we have a word that literally means everyone who isn't us, which is goyim. And shanda for the goyim is when you are behaving in a way in front of non-Jews that makes Jews look bad by like fulfilling a negative Jewish stereotype. So like Bernie Madoff is a shanda for the goyim, So there is so much of this fear of like, if you do something that is bad in a way that people associate with stereotypes of our culture, like it could actually start us on the slope to like killing us or whatever, right? It's like, it is a really wild, deep-seated fear that can complicate the job of telling the truth. I feel like
I like that statement, and it's very appropriate. It's like I think black folks have many similar statements that are close, like acting up in front of company.
Yeah, totally.
Basically, or just the idea of that you don't want to be doing the thing that we are air quote expected to do in front of people that expect us to do that thing. It's one of us looking at one another and saying, "Come on, man, you can't do that in front of these white folks. Like, what you can't be doing that out here." So I like that y'all have a phrase for it. That's freaking fantastic. I might steal that.
Yeah, you should. Another thing I wanted to say back on the culture tip is that, of course, cultures are not monolithic. Like everyone has their own relationship to the cultures they come from, and no one comes from only one culture. There's no such thing as coming from a culture. We all have a kind of intersection of various cultures. And what your interview with June so clearly showed is that investigating the culture you come from can be a way of wrestling with your own identity and figuring out what it means to you or what it means to you in that moment. Because, we're always changing. I don't appear in any of my books, and I don't think I'm going to be in my third, but I realized because my best friend from childhood called me out on this, all three are about things that were incredibly important to me in high school, which I did not realize, but like truly formative events and influences. So they are in a way an autobiography. I'm just not in them.
Yeah.
You do a lot of more explicitly autobiographical work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how doing that has changed your relationship to your cultures, to your history, or helped you rethink the self in some way.
I'm an overthinker, so I feel like I think about things over and over and over until I beat them into a pulp. So much so that when I'm actually reciting them out loud, I definitely have a deep understanding of exactly what I'm saying to you, because I've thought about it 500 times. When it comes to being black, being fat, being a man, anytime I discuss those things on my podcast, it's mostly because I've been thinking about them a lot. So by the time I've stated them on the actual podcast, my relationship with whatever it is has already improved, or let's not even say improved or declined. Let's say just it has changed. It has already changed. Exactly. Yeah. Deepened, made more complex. I think that is really where the change happens. It happens in doing the work before the work even comes out. So by the time you hear the work from me, my relationship has already, changed at that point. So it has. It's hard to be specific about each one of those changes without getting a lot more long-winded. But I will say all of it has been for the better.
Do you find that you pursue a project that's going to create the space for you to like kind of interrogate this stuff? Or is it that you've already reached a point where you've been interrogating it so much you're like, oh, now I've got to make something out of this? Do you know what I mean? Maybe that's a chicken and egg question, but you know what I mean.
It kind of is, but I'm thinking about it right now. Like I'm working on the next season of Wait For It. And there are things happening to me right now that will be in the next season of Wait For It because I'm thinking about them. So it is, for me, easier to produce about things that I'm pondering deeply, especially when I'm trying to have conversations with other folks about those things. So I don't necessarily wait until I've processed it out. I'm like, well, part of this processing is having these discussions and thinking about it and writing about it and recording, and then seeing where we end up as we move forward. And then again, some of the change happens as I'm listening back. I'm like, oh, right, I have even more thoughts about this thing, you know?
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's really a reminder that, you know, you don't need to know everything before you embark on a project. What you have to have are some questions you're interested in and that you think are interesting enough to you that you're going to want to sit with them for months or maybe years, right?
Exactly.
It is not that you have to have the answers.
That's exactly it. I don't ever think I have the answers, honestly, Isaac. I think I ask good questions. Right. And this is something we do at church. Well, this is something I talk about at church where I'm like, a lot of people, when they consult the Bible, consult any holy book, they have a question, they look for the answer in the holy book. And when they open it, they get their answer and they walk away. And I feel like if you're studying anything correctly, you should go with one question and leave with two. Like it should be constantly this idea of trying to find more and more questions because there's no simple answer to anything. And that's kind of how I approach life as well.
It's amazing. Well, that's all the time we have for this week's episode. I'm going to just give you the Slate Plus pitch one more time. Sign up for Slate Plus today at slate.com/workingplus. Get full access behind the paywall. Get wonderful bonus segments on shows like this one. Get full bonus episodes of shows like Slow Burn and Dakota Ring. Thank you in advance, and we hope you enjoy subscribing to Slate Plus at slate.com/workingplus.
Special thanks to our guest, June Thomas, and to our producer, Cameron Drews, who always fosters a culture of excellence. We'll be back next week for June's return to the host chair. She'll be interviewing Francesca Zambello, the artistic director of Washington National Opera. Until then, get back to work.